Welcome back to the panel discussion, Cybersecurity Threat Intelligence, sponsored by RSA on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Ron Karbach, Defense Intelligence Officer for Cyber, Defense Intelligence Agency, Tim Rulin, Chief Information Security Officer, U.S. Census Bureau, Sean Coughlin, Chief Information Security Officer, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Technology Officer at RSA. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy. Well, Zulfikar, I was in the Appalachian Trail on Saturday with my wife, and we went up to this thing called Bear's Den. I looked around and said, "There's no bears here. That's false advertising." And she thought that wasn't very funny. But when you think about cybersecurity, there are a lot of companies that almost represent themselves as, hey, sign up for us and all your worries are over. I mean, so where did the how can you be valued by an agency with the skill set that you bring?
You know, I think you are stumbling upon what is probably one of the most important problems that is plaguing security today. The reality is security has become so much more popular in the last few years. 5 or 10 years ago, if you were in information security, you probably had no idea who your CEO was, or your CISO was. And nowadays, what's happening is security has become this topic that's of interest across the board, from Main Street to Wall Street, from the smallest corporations to the biggest banks. And when you think about that for a moment, there are a couple of different ramifications of that popularity. One of which has been this influx of venture capital funding into security startups. So right now, we're tracking about 1,600 companies that claim to do security in one way, shape, or form. I'm not even sure there are 1,600 people out there who know how to build security technology well. And so that begs the question of what are all these companies delivering if you don't actually have the skill sets to build deep technology? And so I think we have a bit of a lemons market where every one of these companies starts to sound the same, right? You look at their white papers, they all sound great, probably because they plagiarized from the other person's white paper, and they all start to sound like they can solve every problem under the sun. And that's why I made a point earlier about that whole notion of vendor consolidation, really making sure that you're not picking a vendor for their product, you're picking a vendor for a long-term relationship. Because you want to make sure that at the end of the day, if they sold you snake oil, they're going to be held accountable a year from now, 2 years from now, and 5 years from now. And that can only happen if they're around 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and so on. And by the way, most of these 1,600 companies, in fact, 90+% of them only make less than $20 million a year in revenue. When you take a step back and think about what that means from a venture capital perspective, most of these companies are not making that much money. The vast majority of them have venture capital investment of some sort. And typical venture capital investment is designed to last maybe 18 to 24 months. And by the way, the venture capitalist doesn't want to be in the deal beyond 5 to 7 years. In any given year, there may be about 120 to 130 mergers and acquisitions. There's maybe 1 or 2 IPOs in the security space. So when you work all that math out, that means your current class of 1,600 companies will need about 12 to 13 years to achieve a reasonable return on investment for the people who've put money into them. And most of them will not be able to make it because they're not being funded for that long. And so that's something that you have to absolutely consider. It's not just about the technology, it's about, do they have the staying power? Can they form a relationship? Can they provide you with something that's close enough to best of breed today and evolve to meet your needs down the line? Because you have to think long term. We make security decisions once that may last us for years. We don't have the luxury of being able to change our products every 2 months or 3 months. We've got to think about how to make sure that those current decisions we make today are going to serve us well, not just tomorrow, not just 5 months from now, but years from now.
Just echoing that on the customer side, being a customer and purchasing these solutions, the balance as well is my SOC analysts don't have the time to go into every different, have 20 panes of glass for certain types of cyber threats, whether it's just analytics, whether it's loss prevention, whether it's threat intelligence. And there has to be a point with just the amount of data that we're seeing, we're swimming in data, and how do we get to a point where we can consolidate to a single pane of glass to identify, respond, and recover from threats and intrusions across the enterprise?
And I think we're seeing some, or at least over the last 2 or 3 years, I think some market constrictions. As Zulfikar, I don't know if you'd agree, but like things where companies like FireEye are buying eyesight and formulating and pulling that kind of threat data feed intelligence together. So I think maybe the last RSA conference actually in February kind of showed that through the kinds of programs and then the vendors that were in place.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of situations where there are people who are taking features and calling them products.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Things like, for example, user behavior analytics. To me, that's a feature of a monitoring capability. It's not a product in and of itself. It exists only because the SIM community didn't evolve as it should have when it needed to address some more advanced threats. And so I think we have to address that. I mean, we have to really get past that point.
Tim?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, if I could, and again, putting it from a customer perspective, and a customer that has a very unique need every 10 years, we don't wait until the end of the decade to design and plan and look at what we're going to do for the system. And so what Zulfikar was saying about how long it takes some of these young companies, small companies to grow, you know, come 2021, we're going to start planning for the somebody will start planning for the 2030 census. Wow. We're still struggling now with what the technology is going to be firmed up for our 2020 census. Wow. And so looking, when you say build a long-term relationship and find these companies, it works for our regular enterprise, but when we start looking at 10-year gaps and trying to determine what the technology is going to be in 8, 9 years, 7 years, and getting on board with the right technology that can grow with us as we change the designs and adapt to what Congress wants us to do and things like that, makes it very, very difficult.
I think we're all struggling with just planning for a couple years out. I'm not sure we could plan for like 8 or 10, especially when you think about Moore's Law and whether or not that's modified or if it's double Moore's Law today in terms of the technology advancing so far, especially in the broader, you know, from intrusion detection to cyber threat intelligence arenas.
Back the clock, 5 or 10 years ago, nobody could have predicted that cybersecurity would be where it is today.
Right.
So how can we predict where it's going to be 5 or 10 years from now? And that's really why I'm really been emphasizing that notion that it's got to be about a partnership where you can help influence that roadmap, because if you're not able to do that, you're going to find yourself in vendor turnover whack-a-mole for years, and that's not where everybody wants to be. You want to be able to focus on key strategic questions, and you can't do that if you're forced to think short-term with all your resources.
Sean, I've got a question for you. I'm in the classroom a lot, and my students sometimes offer opinions that are a little fuzzy. What I tell them is, in order to be terrific, you got to be specific. Okay, so I'm asking some specifics out of you. Prioritization. Can you give me an example of how you prioritize certain responses to attacks in your agency?
Sure. So we categorize. So we have an incident categorization matrix, and then I'll talk about how we prioritize response. But really, it's you have certain types of threats that could be, if it's, as we're talking about, you know, 0 day, 0 minute type threats, if I may, and what's the response framework for it? Or if we look at other types of, as it rolls down, that if it's a category 4, for example, it could be just some sort of social engineering or phishing attack, for example. So we have different response frameworks of how we respond to it, but and it really depends on the threat. If it's phishing, you want to make sure that if it's something that's reached, if it's gotten down to the user, are you preventing them from clicking on that? Are you restricting that link that's going to reach back to a malicious domain? And then as going back to, as Ron mentioned, defense in depth, there are multiple phases across the network. If it gets into your network, can you make sure that you're going to isolate it at the endpoint, or when the data is on its way back out? Maybe you catch it to say, hey, this has been a known malicious adversary domain. We might need to, we block that domain, and so there's no data leaving the network. So as you triage it, depending on the type of incident and categorize accordingly, that drives our response.
That makes a whole lot of sense. You know, when I think about compliance, it's kind of a funny word. You know, on Monday I'll be in front of about 50 CEOs in Philadelphia, and if I said the word compliance, they'd run out of the room screaming because they hate the word compliance. Now, in the federal government, you want to keep your job, so you have to comply with compliance. Sometimes, you know, if you look at someone, you know. I'll take Ron here. What happens when compliance isn't enough? I mean, if someone says you have to comply with A, B, and C, but you know you must do D, E, and F, and so this is it's no balance here. I mean, compliance can be an opportunity in patience, can't it?
Yeah, so compliance is a little bit out of my lane, but obviously it's critical to ensure you have the most robust kind of people processing technologies in place, right, to get there. And so on top of that, you have to have accountability, right? So what's a compliance without accountability?
So, adding to Ron's comment, I think, and it's not just within the public sector, but private sector as well, whether it's PCI, DIS, GLIBA. I mean, there are a slew of compliance frameworks that are out there, and I think compliance is now is fast becoming the baseline measure, and we have to have proactive risk management and go beyond that compliance framework. And I believe as we have this continued increase in the cyber threat, I believe the level of due diligence is going to go beyond compliance, where whether it's if you're looking at cyber insurance, if you're looking at how the public is going to hold you accountable, if you weren't doing this blatant thing or blatant security measure, even though it wasn't part of the quote unquote compliance, you're still accountable to your consumers, shareholders, your brand, for us, the American citizens.
Zulfikar, I think of this word from the military. It's called field expedient. It's like, okay, we have these codes that you have to comply with, but what happens if it's a problem at 3 o'clock in the morning you never dreamed of? You have to have a field expedient, don't you?
You're right. No, I think, and as we talk about even this notion of compliance, everyone focuses on compliance because it tells you that you have to build at least a 10-foot wall. And we all recognize that adversaries can build an 11-foot ladder at the right time. One of the biggest challenges with compliance in general has been that it's a one-size-fits-all methodology. And the world, as it gets increasingly more complex, is less amenable to such one-size-fits-all approaches. And so I think what you have to be able to do, though, more fundamentally, is you have to ask yourself, are the vendors I'm working with truly concerned about my security, or are they solely focused on compliance? Are they going to literally build me a 10-foot wall, or are they going to shoot for 14 or 15 feet, going beyond the 10 feet, and protect me maybe down the line in some more nefarious scenarios? But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize that distinction between compliance and security, something that I'm sure every security professional agrees with to no end. But we can't possibly achieve that if we only focus on trying to meet that minimum bar.
Sean, if you do any research in the area of cybersecurity, you come across the words people, process, and technology. We all know that. There are sometimes not many limits with technology, but humans, there's always limits. And I think if you have a human limitation, you use a tool. And so the tool you may use is automation. So where does automation fit in this picture? And is automation something you should consider as well?
Sure, great question, John. Looking at this people process technology framework, one of the things we did here within CBP is to create a strategy really built around that, where you hit it on the head, the technology piece, what are the right solutions we need to have in place to protect and defend and manage our enterprise, the processes, how do we, as we talked about earlier, how do we respond to incidents, what are the processes and procedures we need to have in place. Within the people framework, we really focused on training our cyber defenders and training our workforce. How are they becoming? How do we get them and educate them to become more aware? And then on the professional side, whether it's our developers, our engineers, our testers, how do we integrate security practices, secure source code development, secure testing methodologies in place within the enterprise? But to your point, it's not a panacea, and it takes time to do this, and it really impacts everything. It impacts the cost, schedule, and scope of every initiative and program, which makes it challenging. So we have to take an approach to have better security orchestration, automation to drive these processes and procedures. And we have it in a few areas. I think there's still some gaps when you look across the environment in itself and some of the solution gaps. But I think that's the way, with just the limited resources we have and trying to retain the resources we have, you have to move toward automation and orchestration.
But just like Sean said, it's not a panacea to do automation, right? People are important. You mentioned the people, process, technology. The people are our greatest asset, and their knowledge of the process or the workflow or what you're trying to change is imperative, because you don't want to just automate what's happened today. You want to enable and move that to the future. So there was a recent, I think it was last year, Harvard Business Review article about moving beyond automation and limitation there. And there are limitations to automation, specifically if you try to just replace something that was just a process that wasn't as efficient with the people. We can move to tomorrow by saying, okay, what do we really want to accomplish, and use those folks in that process, so that combining the automation with the people who understand what really needs to happen and to make it work will then get you a much better outcome than just saying, let's fix these processes that seem to be able to automate in a script.
I go back to my experience at the Census Bureau over the many years. Being a statistical agency, I've had the fortunate ability to work with a lot of statisticians. And so I think if you take a look at the problem as big data, and a big data type problem, and if attack it from that perspective, it can change the way you look at it. And I found at the Census Bureau, in dealing with it in that way, automation that we're trying to put in place is going to help identify the things that need to be looked at by a human, that need a little bit more. But the other thing is by looking at it from a big data perspective instead of a cybersecurity perspective, I've also got the interest of the people at the Census Bureau who we support, whose mission is to work with large numbers, large data, and couching it as a challenge from a big data perspective has got them now, as you said, thinking about it and becoming more engaged in it. And I think that is part of the problem, and the solution is getting your customers involved in what you're doing.
Anything we can do to push people into actually using their brains as opposed to just doing some kind of rote task in the automation process and driving it to that higher order of thinking, I think, is valuable.
Zulfikar, we got a 50-second challenge for you. Automation, two-edged sword, good or bad? Can be both, can't it?
I think it absolutely can be both. And I think to the point that was raised earlier, security to me is fundamentally a data science problem. It's about being able to gather data across a variety of sources. But if you do that alone, you can quickly end up with essentially a data landfill versus a data lake. To me, the key becomes how do you extract meaningful insights from that data up front and then act on those insights when you ultimately need to be able to do it. And there, I think analytics plays a really critical role in being able to do something interesting with the data you start with. Now, that analytics is not going to necessarily solve every problem for you. It can't automate every problem. It can probably help you a large fraction of the way. The key becomes how do you ensure that your human resources are working on the right kinds of problems for them as opposed to doing a lot of the rote work. A big part of being able to deal with this security shortage is making sure that we have people who are engaged in the work they do. They're not going to be engaged if they're doing repetitive tasks. They're going to be engaged if they're doing meaningful work.
My guests today are Ron Karbach, Defense Intelligence Officer for Cyber, Defense Intelligence Agency, Tim Rulin, Chief Information Security Officer, U.S. Census Bureau, Sean Kalfin, Chief Information Security Officer, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Zulfikar Ramzan, Chief Technology Officer at RSA. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the discussion, Cybersecurity Threat Intelligence, sponsored by RSA on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.